Tana koto katoa. It's hard to believe this year is nearly over, and tonight sees us holding our last webinar for 2020, but also providing an introduction to a series that will run in 2021. This evening, we are fortunate to have Elle CRADWICK with us. Elle holds a Master's in Psychology and works in suicide postvention and prevention. Originally from the amazing country of United Kingdom, Elle is now based in, I'm sure, the equally amazing Waitaha, Canterbury. Currently, Elle is embarking on a project driven by understanding that safe, supportive conversations have the power to change or even save a life. Communication is a fundamental skill required to support someone in mental distress. This webinar series will be focused on teaching and refining everyday communication skills for healthcare providers to apply in conversations about mental health and well-being. As we go along, as I say, feel free to use your chat function to introduce yourself, where you're from, what work you do, and any questions for Elle, if you can add them to the Q&A tab. And I shall now hand you over to Elle. Thank you.
Kia ora, Kathy. Kia ora koutou. What a beautiful introduction. Couldn't have said it better myself. Awesome to be here, guys, virtually with you all from around Aotearoa. So as Kathy has sort of talked about, this is the first in a bit of a series, if you would like to join, no obligation, which is about having kōrero, having conversations, big chats about mental health. So today we're going to look a little bit about, you know, that notion when you get on a plane and you know, you get all the nice, here are your exits, here's your safety jacket, and if the oxygen masks fall, please put it on yourself before somebody else. And most of us here, I understand, are in kind of healthcare professions, caring professions. And in these professions, it's particularly important when we are kind of looking outside and helping outside to also make sure that we are well as much as we can with all that we juggle. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about things like vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, burnout, a little bit about self-care as well. My typical way of presenting is quite interactive, so obviously a little bit harder over a webinar, but I really want to encourage you guys to use the chat, use the Q&A. I might not have the answers to these questions, but at least we could start a little kōrero and perhaps follow up with some answers if you guys want to join me on the journey of the next webinars in the new year. So these next webinars are going to be developed based on what I hear from you guys would be helpful. So there's that overarching, let's learn about the how-to of conversations about mental health. And then we can throw in context, we can talk about that in context with things like suicide or risk assessment or de-escalation, those kinds of things. So, and I'll do my best to kind of draw those together and meet the needs that you guys are seeing, because you're the kai mahi on the ground. You guys are the ones doing the mahi. So really want to develop as much as I can something that will fit your needs. Awesome. So ko wai koe. My name's Elle CRADWICK. I was born in the UK, came over here, I've been here about 15 years. My whānau, my family is all in healthcare pretty well. So that's kind of in the dinner table conversations. I'm took a little bit of a different path, but very passionate about mental health and well-being. So I finished my master's in psychology, looking at emotion regulation, particularly with the emotion shame, which seemed a little bit out there to begin with, but the more I kind of dug into it, the more I thought, ooh, shame really underlies a lot of what we do. So my day job, I work as a suicide prevention coordinator through Pegasus Health, which is the PHO one of 3 PHO down here in Waitaha, Canterbury. So that involves a little bit of prevention, which is huge, factors that contribute to suicide, and postvention as well. So that is after there has been a loss. And we work at a community level, so we don't work in an individual level. So these workshops are kind of with my other hat. This is me as a person with an idea, you know. Something that I've seen a lot is this big gap of people sort of saying, oh, we need to talk about stuff. We need to, if you're worried about somebody, ask how they're doing. And the big gap at the moment being for most of us, oh my God, how do I do that? How do I do that safely? So really what Big Chats is to me is something in development, is the how-to of conversations about mental health and well-being. So mental health and well-being on a kind of spectrum, on a continuum. So although I have a master's in psychology, I would just do a little disclaimer that I am a psychologist, maybe with a little p, not a big P. I'm not a practicing clinician. So, you know, always encourage people to kind of get another perspective or another expert advice on what I say. I've done my best, but I've not got the big P. Awesome. So a couple little sort of admin things, as I said, ask lots of questions. A little bit of a kind of a, hey, a heads up. I've already touched on my mahi as a suicide prevention coordinator. Some of the stuff we're talking about, like vicarious trauma, post-traumatic stress, secondary post-traumatic stress. Some of the examples that I may be using are a little bit full on. If that is something that kind of hits for you, please feel free to take a breather, that's fine. Please feel free to kind of take a minute, and also we'll talk about self-care. So perhaps after this, if it's been a bit heavy, we'll have developed a little bit of a plan for self-care as well that you will be able to use too. Also, you'll need a little something to write on if you choose to participate in the little task later on. So pen and paper or your phone or your laptop, whatever you've got in front of you. Awesome, Kathy is all sorted. And also want to kind of do a little bit of a bringing us here. So it's a really busy time of year, and it's been a year. It's been a hell of a year. Just want to kind of everybody to take a little bit of a second and do a, okay, I'm here now. There's a lot of stuff in my head. There's a whole lot of stuff in my head. Let's just kind of focus on the here and now. I know that's something I struggle with. I'm not going to tell you that I'm an expert at that, but just kind of really trying to ground ourselves into where we are at the moment. Okay. So the context of these topics for you guys as healthcare professionals. In your roles, you will more often than not be this little hand around the branch. You're giving far more often, typically in a day-to-day, without knowing all of you guys, unfortunately, not knowing your mahi, but healthcare professionals, typically, you'll be giving more than receiving. We also have had a huge year, and I'm based in Canterbury, Waitaha, Canterbury. We also, as a region, have a lot of shared experiences as a community, and also on an individual level. You know, although in Canterbury we might talk about earthquakes and shootings and the gas explosion and things like that, actually as individuals, sometimes life just throws shit at us, you know, and we don't have control over that. So somebody might be kind of in a region which is free from all of that, but have had a lot of heavy stuff happen personally or to the people close to them. So we need to look after ourselves too. Just a little bit about the context of the pandemic this year. I was listening to a webinar from Vale Wright, who's a psychologist in the USA, and she was talking about the impact of the pandemic from what she has seen as a lot of trepidation, grief and loss, those kind of lost hopes and dreams, and also all of this stuff, the uncertainty, things that we didn't anticipate. So we've got off pretty lightly in New Zealand. I think most of us kind of go, oh yeah, we're glad we're in New Zealand. But these are still things that we have experienced this year, and some of us have experienced to varying degrees. And they're ongoing because this hasn't closed, you know. So just want to acknowledge that we are coming to the end of a hell of a year for many people. So we're going to cover briefly burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress. And then we need to talk about a bit of hope, don't we? So self-care. And then we'll have a big space for patai and korero, so questions and comments on this kind of thing. So it looks like we've got about 50 people here, so we might have a chance to have a little bit of a chat, which is nice with smaller numbers. So please feel free to throw any ideas out there as well. So vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress usually emerge related to work with traumatized populations or populations in crisis. Compassion fatigue can occur kind of in any caring occupation. That might be an occupation or it might be a life role. So people caring for those with disabilities, you might be caring for an elderly parent, and I suppose to some extent, you know, caring for children as well, caring for wider whānau. And burnout is that kind of exhaustion specifically related to a job, to an occupation. So these are kind of concepts that I'm just wanting to offer out. They're not clinical diagnoses. They are things that I'm hoping make sense as concepts which may or may not sit with you. Oh, the lovely Kate here has just informed me that I've forgotten to share my screen, which is completely unhelpful. Let's go back a couple of slides. Let's just recap, because I had some sort of whizzy pictures. There you go, first timer, can you tell? So this was that when I was talking about the context, when I was talking about giving versus receiving, this was the photo that I was showing. So this is a kind of lifting up other people, supporting other people, and the impact that that might have on us is this little hand. So you haven't missed much. Here you go. Better than my mug on the screen. Firstly, burnout. Where does this word come from? Burnout literally is a metaphor which is describing that state of complete exhaustion, similar to the extinguishing of a burning flame. So that spark was lit, the flame was burning bright, but now where there used to be a spark, it's dark and the fuel has kind of all been used up. So we may have heard a lot of burnout, and it's a little bit of a buzzword. So we want to kind of give a little bit more color to that. I'll give it a bit of an example of that. So burnout is very specifically related to your job, to your role, to occupational stress and exhaustion. It kind of doesn't apply to stuff outside of work, so home stuff, for example, or kind of, it's not a global concept, it's just related to your work. So for example, you might have a receptionist at a GP practice, for example. Perhaps this is a rural GP practice and there's only one receptionist, but it is in quite a busy town. And the receptionist, it's just that one person. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of patients who come through the door. The practice perhaps has limited resource. Perhaps they're going through a bit of a staffing change. So a lot is falling on that one receptionist. And perhaps that receptionist feels like they don't have adequate resourcing to do their job. Perhaps they used to, but perhaps for reasons outside of their control, there isn't enough resourcing. So they're constantly feeling like they're a little bit behind. They've got a queue in front of them. They've got to get the invoicing done. They've got to get medtech up to date. They've got to do the transfers, all that kind of thing. It's just too much. And actually it's just them. It's kind of just them in that role. And then perhaps there's the kind of more clinical staff, and perhaps they feel a little bit separate to them. So we'll come back to that example in a little bit. Burnout is really defined by three dimensions, within it being a prolonged response to chronic emotional and interpersonal stressors in a job. So emotional exhaustion being one's resources just become really depleted by the chronic needs, the chronic demands, ongoing every day, needs and expectations of their clients, their supervisors, their organizations. So perhaps that receptionist is kind of that front-facing person, and perhaps they've had a few pissed off clients recently. So that's a need repeatedly kind of that they're repeatedly seeing. And combined with the lack of organizational resources, perhaps that's contributing to this huge emotional exhaustion that they're feeling. And the other dimension is cynicism or depersonalization. That's about feeling detached or feeling particularly cynical or negative towards the recipients of care, towards their colleagues, or kind of just towards the role in general, towards the practice perhaps. And inefficacy, so that feeling of incompetence, that, oh my God, whatever I try, I cannot get on top of these invoices. Or no matter what I try, these people are still getting pissed off because I can't book them in with the GPs. And then another bit of an example of that kind of inefficacy, particularly if you're a provider of healthcare yourself, you know, you're that clinical staff, can be seen often when clients don't respond to treatment in spite of your best efforts. So that might be that inefficacy, you know, I'm trying so hard, but no matter what I can seem to do, they are not responding to treatment. So very much job related. Whether or not burnout is kind of this clinical diagnosis is something very contested. It is not in the DSM-5. It is in the ICD. So the WHO popped it in there very briefly, and it's defined as a state of vital exhaustion. So emotional exhaustion, we've kind of seen that. Critics will say that burnout is not a kind of valid construct in itself. I mean, it can be a valid word to describe an experience, you know, that linguistic determination type thing. This is a word to describe an experience. That's valid. I'm not saying that just because it's not a diagnosis, we shouldn't use that. One of the big criticisms is that it's just about this one, it's just job related, you know, it's just in this little box. And experts will say, actually, there's huge overlap with depression. And I think I've seen that as well. I've experienced that a little bit, you know, and I wonder how many other people who are providers of healthcare services in this ZUI today might also think, oh, I've kind of felt a little bit like that. And perhaps this is something that I've heard a lot through work is, it's been a hell of a year. I'm tired. I'm really tired. We can also feel really tired and drained. And that's kind of can be a little bit of a normal part of the human condition, you know. Life that's sold to us isn't, you know, it doesn't have to be all kind of, we're happy all the time, we're well all the time, you know, our well-being will kind of go up and down, and that's really normal as a human being. Once it gets a little bit to the point where you're thinking, this is something bigger, I'm really struggling to escape from it, this is outside of my control. We'll come back to this as well. That would be the kind of threshold for seeking help. We'll talk a little bit about help seeking too. One of the things that the research is saying is that self-compassion can play a little bit of a protective role in burnout. So things like self-care, things like noticing, things like being okay with the level of work. So being okay with these mistakes that we're making, having compassion for ourselves. This is really busy right now, but I'm trying my best. Easier said than done though sometimes, eh? So on the kind of job, in the topic of jobs, job-related burnout, there's a lot of research that talks kind of about the person-to-job match quality being a really significant contributor to feelings of burnout. And how well they match can be, can fall sort of into 6 categories broadly. So things like workload, too much, not enough resources. Control, are you feeling micromanaged? Do you feel you have a lack of influence? Do you have accountability without power? That can kind of be that middle management level in a typical organization, or in healthcare, it can just be, you know, the buck kind of stops with you a little bit and you're on the ground. Reward, are you feeling acknowledged? That could be kind of through the way that your colleagues or the patients interact with you, or through pay, or even just your feeling, your internal feeling of satisfaction. Your community, isolation, conflict, disrespect, fairness, so is the discrimination, is the favoritism, and values. How well does that kind of sit with your own values, the mahi that you do? Are there ethical conflicts in your role? Are there kind of meaningless tasks that are added to your workload, which in the context of having so much on your workload, they just don't feel like they fit? Also want to acknowledge that a lot of people who come to healthcare roles, you've done years of training, it is kind of a career, and sometimes if you're feeling like the match isn't quite right at the moment, it doesn't mean necessarily a career change. For some it can, and that's okay. But for some it can be a little bit of a change of scene, a refresher. So I think in other contexts, it might be a little bit easier to say to people, hey, think about how well your job matches with all of these things. I do acknowledge that for healthcare professionals particularly, there's such investment, you know, in that career to begin with study, with work experience. That's not always necessarily that easy. And of course, that's only when it's something that would apply. Vicarious trauma. So this is really about working directly with trauma. So vicarious trauma is about having profound shifts in your worldview and the way that you think of the world as a result of working directly with trauma. So this can be things like alterations in one's sense of self, or a change in worldviews about issues like trust and safety, changes in spiritual beliefs, And this is something that kind of, there is typically a cumulative chronic nature to this. So I'll give it an example close to home. So for me, we get notified of every suspected suicide death in Canterbury. We're working with trauma. So a little shift in worldview that has occurred for me in my time in the role is when I see a person who is perhaps acting a little bit strangely, or perhaps is walking somewhere a little bit unusual, my brain goes straight to the crisis, where actually that might not be anything to do with their experience, but that's a shift in worldview where I think it's this experience that is shared by so many people versus suicide is rare. It is rare. So one that's a little bit close to home for me. Secondary traumatic stress is best characterized as behavioral symptoms. So whereas vicarious trauma is a little bit more about worldview, shifting cognitions, this is about behavioral symptoms. So that's as a result of bearing witness to the horror of trauma without necessarily that shift in worldview. But that person will then experience behavioral symptoms, which are very parallel to post-traumatic stress disorder. So one example might be emergency department staff treating an abused child. After that experience, they might recognize that they're having intrusive thoughts, perhaps, going back to that point in time with that young person, that child who's in front of them, or nightmares, or then have difficulty concentrating with that kind of in the back of their minds, or at its sort of extreme, we see a kind of hypervigilance and a startle reaction towards kind of reminders of that trauma. And that might be really hard if you come to work in the emergency department every day. So that's, again, vicarious trauma is more about thoughts, worldview. Secondary traumatic stress is more about behavior. Compassion fatigue is burnout plus symptoms of secondary traumatic stress, so those behaviors. This comes, literally, compassion fatigue, chronic use of empathy and compassion, and the tiredness that comes as a result of that. So there's a cumulative exposure to suffering. Perhaps that's also to trauma, particularly in a role where your role is to alleviate that suffering. So an example might be palliative care staff. So that's that continual exposure to that really huge suffering, not just of that person, but of their whānau, of their support network around them. And also, I was thinking about this in the context of rural healthcare and thinking that for communities that we are working with in rural communities, so for healthcare staff that we're working in rural communities, they often talk about being everything to everybody. So if you haven't got a counsellor in your community, but perhaps the nurse who is taking your blood pressure is a warm, caring person, as many healthcare professionals are. What does that mean in terms of a fluidity of role? Perhaps that person starts opening up because that's their experience. A rugged farmer who's kind of struggling with something, maybe just financially, maybe they're not mentally unwell, maybe they're just really stressed because the farmer's not doing very well this year. And they have an opportunity to have a warm conversation with that nurse. So I think that there is a little bit more colour when we're talking about rural practitioners, also because rural practitioners live and work in the same community. You can kind of get lost in a city, but you might be seeing the people that you're treating in the supermarket. And what does that mean in terms of alleviating suffering, particularly in terms of, and compassion fatigue is really about profound emotional and physical erosion when workers are unable to refuel and regenerate. So, perhaps you're on your day off and you pop to the supermarket and then you see somebody who kind of goes, oh, I talked to you about this last week, want you to know how it's going this week, those kinds of things. So not that opportunity to refuel. So compassion fatigue really is that drain of compassion. You've got nothing left. You've got nothing left to give. So there's burnout, which is kind of that huge exhaustion, but that doesn't mean that you're necessarily drained of compassion, you're just tired. Compassion fatigue means that huge depletion. So a bit of a summary of these 4 constructs. Related to work, burnout related to work, parallels to depression. I think that can be helpful, and I really want to just acknowledge if you have kind of connected to that feeling of burnout, and then this perhaps may be the first time that that word depression might be used in connection to that. Acknowledging that there may be some for whom that is the first time those have been connected. So again, if this is kind of making you go, oh, actually, this stuff that I've been kind of processing, this is pretty big, please do reach out for advice or for help. Compassion fatigue is that empathy exhaustion, vicarious trauma, that shift in worldview, and secondary traumatic stress is that shift in behaviors. So vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress can be emerge from the same event. There might be individual differences in terms of whether one person might experience vicarious trauma as a result of that, or one person might experience secondary traumatic stress. But it's the behavior versus worldview distinction. So whereas burnout is kind of more general, related to anything to do with work, the bottom 3 are really about specifically related to work with trauma populations and about suffering. The other kind of distinction is that burnout and compassion fatigue typically are a little bit more cumulative. So a little bit of those stressors, or that little slow creep and kind of, oh man, I'm finding this really hard over time. Whereas vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress can have a really immediate onset after an experience of vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. There'll also be individual and situational factors that contribute to what a response looks like. And also really acknowledging that some people do really heavy stuff and never experience any of this. And that's, I mean, great for you, that's awesome. And there's a huge amount of individual and situational factors that will be protective, that might contribute to that amount of resilience. Or you can still be really resilient and then experience these things. You know, life throws stuff at us. And we have a certain level of control over that, but sometimes it just comes, you know. So individual factors that might contribute to how these look might be your current life circumstances. So say you've experienced something really heavy, say, you know, going back to that ED example, and also you are raising children, that kind of connection. You can connect that young person who's in front of you with a young person at home. That might elevate your response to that situation. So that can be a bit of history as well. So individual factors, current life circumstances like that, your history, whether you've had any trauma in your past, coping styles, what your kind of default or what your learned coping styles are as well. If they're a bit more maladaptive, like suppressing emotions, that may be that these kinds of experiences don't have a chance to bubble and sort of resolve or become managed. They could kind of be exacerbated by that. No, let's not think about it. And also acknowledging sometimes we have to put it in a box to carry on, but we also need to balance that out with some really positive coping strategies as well to look after ourselves so we can carry on. Situational factors as well. I'm thinking particularly related to burnout. I think what I've seen a lot is kind of the self-blame that comes from feeling burnt out. Oh my God, I used to be able to do this fine, but I can't anymore. Why can't I? There's a lot of organizational factors as well that contribute to feeling burnt out. So lack of resourcing, you know, the receptionist has no control over the staffing at the GP practice, for example. It may also be about the culture of a place that you work with. Maybe about whether you've got, so in my role, we have clinical supervision and mental health roles typically. Collegial support as well. Do you have somebody else who kind of knows this, who you can vent with? So there's a wraparound of lots of different things that might contribute to how we each as individuals, as unique individuals, experience adverse events. And again, the coping skills that we use. So when to get help. if any of these concepts are really sitting with you and you're going, oof, actually, yep, I feel this, and I don't think a holiday is kind of going to make this any better, really encourage you to reach out to somebody. So that might be somebody, a friend that you trust, a colleague that you trust, that might be a partner, that might be a parent, that might be somebody in your work that you know and you trust, or that might be a helpline. Some really awesome helplines out there. 1737 is great. Your GP as well is a kind of is your go-to. For those of you who are GPs as well, use your GP too. In a rural setting, acknowledging as well that confidentiality can sometimes be tricky, particularly for those who, you know, we are the givers. What if people know that we are not doing so well ourselves? So now one of the small silver linings with COVID is that there are a lot of services that are operating online. So really encourage you to take stock, have a think about where you are. And if you feel like you will benefit from it, it might be a brave thing to do to reach out as well. Or some of you might go, actually, I'm fine. I'm just keen to know about this for the people I work with or for my patients, for my clients. That's fine. So let's talk a little bit about self-care. This is what I got when I Googled self-care, hashtag self-care. So in light of all those kinds of concepts that we've been talking about, it's really important that we have strong self-care practices. And I'm going to come back to the word practice as well. I just want to comment on the self-care. Oh, what do I think? I think that's a consumerized and a very feminized construct, hashtag self-care. You need this product to do self-care. What it can also look like is paying your bills, is writing a to-do list, is going for a run even though you kind of hate it, but you actually feel better afterwards. It's just that 5-minute cup of tea in the morning, it's having a sleep, it's interacting with your pets, it's having a healthy meal. It doesn't have to be glamorous. You don't have to put it on Facebook or Instagram. Sometimes it's doing that thing that we have been putting off because it's been pissing us off and it's just got to get done. I really don't want to do it, but it's just got to get done. So it could look like that beautiful, healthy plate of food, or it could look like this, or maybe you're more of this kind of a person. That's fine. I'm not here to tell you that you have to eat healthy for self-care. Self-care is about noticing and taking time for yourself, whatever that looks like for you. It's going to be different for all of us. So I was thinking a little bit about, okay, doing this webinar for healthcare practitioners, you know, I thought, oh, this could be interesting. And I'm not the expert in this, so I don't know how well this is going to land, but here's a little idea I had. Is the concept of preventative versus interventional self-care. So let's try a parallel. You can tell me in the chat if I've got this right. Vitamin C, right? Preventative, we know that it boosts our immune system. Versus antibiotics, that's when we do have an infection. Self-care can be preventative as well. So you can do little doses of self-care, which will help build our reserve such that we can carry on giving. And also sometimes you might go, whoa, I'm way up to here. I really just need to take, I need to take a day. I need to take a sick day, or I just need to go bush. Whatever that looks like for you, that's that kind of interventional, or I need a huge change. Preventative versus interventional. They can be the same things practically. So this is kind of like the parallel, you know, early identification of how we are. We can do early treatment, self-care treatment, and that might be therapy, that might not be therapy, that might just be a regular walk. A better chance of kind of ongoing wellness. So to define professional self-care, it's the utilization of skills and strategies by workers to maintain their own personal, familial, emotional, and spiritual needs while attending to the needs and demands of their clients. We need to be well to look after other people. So the practice of self-care. Practice because this is a learned skill. You know, how many of us are not just busy at work, but also busy at home? Oh, I don't have time to do that. I don't have time for myself. Oh, I've been wanting to go to yoga. I've been wanting to do this, but I actually just don't have time. And you kind of collapse in a heap at the end of the day. And perhaps that's when you start to use those maladaptive coping skills, you know, whatever that looks like for you. Maybe that's having one too many to drink. Maybe that for me, sometimes it's just scrolling mindlessly on my phone, which does absolutely nothing for me, but it's easy. Self-care requires us 3 big things. Noticing. We have to notice how we're doing. We have to notice when we might benefit from it, when we might need it. Then we have to give ourselves time. How easily do we give ourselves to other people? How hard is it to give to ourselves? And then we actually have to pull through. We actually have to do it. And it's a learned skill. So I really want to say, if you're starting to kind of look at incorporating really deliberate self-care practice, it's going to be a journey. Listen, like I'm here teaching a webinar about self-care. I haven't done yoga in 2 weeks. I know it's really good for me. I like to do it 2 or 3 times a week, but it's just been crazy. You know, we're human. So when I'm talking about this stuff, I also really want to say, be gentle with yourself. Be kind to yourself. This isn't an easy thing to just go, oh, I'm going to look after myself and it's all going to be fine. If you're not managing to do it and things are hard, guilt serves no one either. Try and go gentle on yourself. Again, easier said than done. Also, when things are heavy, I want to talk a little bit briefly about hope. It's a slight sidetrack, but it's something that in my work I see as so important. Finding small areas of hope, something to look forward to. Can you plan a holiday? Can you plan something? Can you plan that yoga session, whatever it might be? Just a little bit of something to look forward to that gives you hope, that you know it's coming. Also, a really useful thing to do can be when we're stopping and taking notice, when we're being mindful, sensitively confronting that feeling of perhaps urgency that can come from really non-urgent tasks. Like, oh, I need to check my emails, or I need to do this. Or actually, does it matter if I do that tomorrow? Is it going to be any different if I just leave that tomorrow? So we'll come a little bit to habit building as well, and what habit building around self-care looks like. So practice habit building. So I said you guys would need a pen and paper. Now's the time. So want to do a little bit of a brainstorm for you guys so that by the end of this, you'll have a little run sheet. So we're going to do some, develop together some things that you can do when you have different time frames as well, that you might be able to do some stuff for yourself, taking time for yourself. So briefly, I want you to think about how you might notice how you're doing, really how you're doing. So signs and symptoms of when you're not doing so well, or how you might notice. So one of my colleagues was talking about how he knows he's had a really heavy day is when he doesn't turn on the radio when he drives home. That's his little tell. Or I've driven home this whole time and I haven't turned the radio on. For me, sometimes it can just be I drive somewhere and I sit in my car. I don't get out. Oh God, I'm tired. I'm tired today. It takes a lot to get out. So those are some little tells. Some of the kind of how-to might be a really deliberate. I'm just going to take a second before the client walks into the door to think, how am I doing today? Or a kind of body scan, you know, how is my body? My clinical supervisor is really big into what's your body telling you. And you guys are healthcare professionals, you might have a bigger concept of what that looks like than I do. A lot of us hold tension in different places as well. So hopefully you've got a couple of ideas down for that. So the next one, what are some of the things that you can do that take time for yourself if you just have 5 minutes? And I'll give you a few ideas to start you off with. Make a hot drink. A lot of people make a kind of chaos coffee in the morning. What about you guys? I do a bit of that, you know, quick coffee in me before I see anybody. Taking your time to do that and really enjoying the coffee as well. Write down a to-do list, all from here down on paper, clear. Focus breathing, listening to music, being mindful. And then the next one is about if you have 15 minutes to do something for yourself. You've got a little bit more time, but you don't have a heap of time. You know, you've just got back from work, but you know the school bus is coming really quickly. So quick, some time for yourself. So perhaps that's a quick walk, reading, planning your meals for the week, paying a bill, those kinds of things for 15 minutes. Awesome. So hoping you've got a few tasks there that might work if you've got 15 minutes in your day for some self-care. And the next one, what about an hour? What if it's your day off? You've got an hour, you know that there's time for yourself. So these might be things like catching up with somebody, going for a walk without your phone, cleaning something because you feel better in a clean space, reorganizing something that's been annoying you for a while, or also something like doing that thing that you've kind of been dreading. There's been something that's been on your mind for ages, a silly little task, but you just haven't managed to get to it in ages. Actually setting aside the time to do that and feel proud for doing that. And then the next one is a little bit about what habits might be doable for you to form around taking time for yourself, looking out for yourself. This might be a bit of a harder one to kind of brainstorm. This might be a bit longer term. This might feel a little bit harder to accomplish. So things like removing electronics before bedtime, using your breaks. I know that's not often doable. For some of you, that just won't be practical. But if you can, actually having a rest during the day can be really, can really help nurture you and fill your cup up. Not checking emails or your phone as soon as you wake up, waking up slowly. Setting realistic goals can be a really big one. That's one of those huge ways of, if you look at talk therapy for depression, one thing that many therapists will do is supporting that person to set small realistic goals. I think even if we're not clinically depressed, that can be really useful for us. Actually, what can I do today? So that you can feel like you've ticked off the list versus a huge unrealistic to-do list. And then we always beat ourselves up for not doing it. It wasn't realistic to begin with. And all the usual, sleep, rest as well as sleep, just rest and food. So hopefully there's a few ideas down on that piece of paper or in your phone of some go-tos for self-care if you feel that you need some interventional self-care, or that you can use on a more day-to-day level for that kind of preventative self-care. As healthcare professionals, you are in giving professionals, that you are in a giving profession. And that can have a huge impact on all of you at different points in your life as well. So filling up your own cup, putting on your own oxygen mask as well to enable you to carry on doing the amazing work that you do in your rural settings, in your rural communities. So that wraps up the little bit about self-care, about burnout and kind of those associated constructs. I want to talk a little bit about what might happen in the next webinars, depending on what you guys are telling me that you would find helpful. This is something that, this is the project that I'm working on, Big Chats about mental health, Big Chats. This comes from the most powerful way of supporting someone is enabling them to feel heard. So that is it's a quote that wraps up what my little vision is for how this little idea that I have at the moment in development could uplift those conversations that so many of us are having with people already in our professions and our everyday lives about how they're doing. And sometimes someone will kind of go, oh, actually, I'm not doing so well. And you go, whoa, hang on, well, I wasn't ready for that. What do I say? What do I say if that's what it... So incorporating some communication skills in the context of those specific topics determined by you guys from the survey. This is what the next year's webinar series will look like. So this emerges from a need that I've seen personally and professionally, the how-to of conversations. So how can we make them safer, more supportive, more mana enhancing? And a conversation might just be a little text interaction. It might be a supermarket conversation. It might be a really big sit-down conversation. And as Kathy said to begin with, that's this kind of understanding that I've seen in my professional career so far and my personal life, that the huge impact that a warm, caring conversation can have on somebody. Also want to acknowledge that many of you will have had those warm, caring conversations with people. One of the things I say, putting my other hat back on now, one of the things that I say in my suicide prevention role is that, you know, all of you guys out there are also doing that kind of work around suicide prevention, around well-being. So this is not new stuff for you guys. This is about refining, this is about answering questions and putting it in context with some of those broader topics. So before we go into questions, I've got a little bit of homework for you, if you would like. For the next 3 days, take 15 minutes for yourself. Just 15 minutes. And Kathy's pulling a funny face. That might be quite hard for many of you. So it's a challenge. It's a homework challenge. You could set a timer so that you're not watching the clock as well. You're not going, oh, 9 minutes. Oh, you know, got to get something done in the next 3 minutes. And also have a little think about removing the should out of whatever you feel you should be doing with your downtime. You know, I might say, oh, I've got to put the washing out. Actually, that's quite chill. That could be my self-care. You know, that might be the case. That's fine. What is something that you really feel compelled to do that might be doing nothing, that is just taking 15 minutes for yourself? If you choose to accept. It's not easy. Okay. So that's me, and we've got some time for questions or discussion.
Oh, thank you, Ellie. That was fantastic. Some real good food for thought there. A lot of hard work there, though, thinking what you do with 5 minutes and 50 in an hour. Wow. So we've got one question here so far, and we've got, well, it's more like a statement, as a guess, but just to share as well. The accumulation of trauma erodes resilience. When you are a rural practitioner, resilience is essential to longevity. But when you become burnt out, you don't see the signs until it is often too late. How do you find the time to treat yourself and have time off? So yeah, I guess you've kind of already given us some suggestions as to how you would do that to find the time to treat yourself. But I'll see what else you've got to add.
Absolutely. I mean, very eloquently put about trauma eroding our own resilience, and the fact that it's really hard to notice. You do become a little bit blind or even disillusioned to those symptoms. It's really easy to say, oh, it's fine, let's carry on. And particularly if you're working with trauma, there can be a kind of comparative nature to this. Oh, I'm just really tired, but these people have it so much worse. You know, am I justified in feeling exhausted when I know that this is what other people in my community, what my patients are going through? I wish I had the answers to that question. I don't. I think perhaps that might be something that if I were in that position, and if I was lucky enough to have that little glimmer of self-awareness, which I acknowledge is really hard, that would probably be something that I would seek further support on, regardless of what that looks like. An extra conversation. I'm lucky to have my clinical supervisor in that role. Our colleagues can play that role as well if you're lucky in that, pulling you up on stuff. And the people around us, you know, it might be noticing in ourselves can be harder than listening. Sometimes listening to other people, oh God, you're being a dick lately, you know, why are you so grumpy at me all the time? Or that might be your family rather than your colleagues, or your colleagues saying, I'm really worried about you, you're looking really tired lately. Yeah, sorry to not have a clearer answer to that. It is very hard.
No, I think you've answered it really well, Ellie, actually, because it is a hard one. But like you say, it's that rounded thing, isn't it? Potentially the supervisor, your colleagues, your family. And again, it comes back to what you said in the start before you even started with your flyers. It's about communication. It's about people talking and about sharing. And someone's saying here, often it's easier to tell others about self-care in our professional roles, as it's automatic, but difficult to put into practice ourselves.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yes. And then we've got
with others that I sometimes think about. What would it be like for me if I stood in front of a mirror and I had the kind of conversations that I have with the people I'm working with? God, that would be hard. Hey, you okay? I really think that you need to look after yourself. And seeing you do that to yourself, you know, we're our own harshest critics. It can be so hard to take on the messages that we're projecting outwards. But are we being really genuine to the mahi that we're doing if we're not listening ourselves? Yeah,
that kind of fits here with this lady saying, I've always felt I've had to push through rather than take time off, i.e. use sick leave, as I worry about letting my colleagues down and also work with really sick people working in palliative care. So there's always that feeling that you need to keep going. But she says, your webinar tonight, this has opened my eyes. So thank you very much.
Oh, that's really beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And I can imagine in a rural setting, there's fewer of you. You know each other so much more closely than perhaps in a big city. And you might know the impact that time off might have on somebody else as well, a little bit better than it kind of, oh, we'll just find somebody on this big roster, you know. I think one of the things I think about is when I'm kind of having that conversation, when we're having those internal conversations, what would I say to a colleague if they said that to me? Would I actually say, oh, for God's sake, go and take some time off? Might that actually be what your colleagues would want rather than you carrying on going and carrying on going? Yeah, I don't know if you've got a relationship with your colleagues that you can ask them that or if they would tell you, but really humble to hear of the kind of impact of stopping to think about this stuff. Sometimes it can just be that seed of actually stopping and thinking.
Absolutely. And as I was saying here, I really enjoyed that you acknowledged that we sometimes feel that others are more deserving than ourselves. So,
yep. Hard reality, eh?
Absolutely. And the wonderful Mark, he's obviously lingering in the background there. Evening, Mark. He says, so how can we carry this conversation on?
As individuals, we can carry this conversation on as a smaller group if you guys would like to. We can carry this conversation on internally in ourselves. We could, you know, one of the tools in terms of habit building, what if I don't know what your rosters are, at some point in your rostering week, if you could say, maybe it's at the midpoint or maybe it's at the kind of start of the week, you actually go, here's my habit. How am I? How am I doing this week? What am I planning? And the conversation with ourselves is the most important conversation to have because we're the only one who knows what goes on upstairs. Sometimes we don't know it all, right? Why did I say that? Why am I doing that? But carrying on that, taking notice of ourselves.
There's a lovely one here. There's someone saying here, tout up the struggles to have the time for self-care. I worked with a Rongo practitioner who would always do Tai Chi stretch after each client. I used to think, what a weirdo. It wasn't long ago that I had a sudden realization that it was actually genius. I had to find my version of Tai Chi, which ended up being grounding exercises between each client. It just takes a couple of minutes.
Awesome. How cool. I love that shift in worldview of why is he doing that? Oh, actually, I need to find my groove with that as well. What's the kind of little cleansing thing that I can do as well? Because often as well as practitioners, you know, one person comes in the door, they go out, and then in comes the next one, and we've kind of got to shift our mindsets to be all there for that next person. Whoa, I can only imagine how taxing that is.
Another good comment here, a valuable tool is also permission giving. Yeah,
absolutely. Giving yourself permission to not do it right all the time. Self-compassion, that kind of comes us back to that self-compassion being a little bit of an antidote to burnout. Giving ourselves permission to be human, giving ourselves permission to take time for ourselves. I love it.
And then we've got someone's commenting here saying pharmacists have started a New Zealand pharmacist inspirational group to encourage ourselves to be positive. So obviously your timing with this webinar is reaching out across other people who are thinking in these lines too. And funnily, the next one says, this webinar is so timely. I'm a strong believer that nurses should have clinical supervision and outside supervision if you understand that. Reach out for help. It may be with your GP colleagues. Remember, we are only human. Identify and accept the signs of burnout And so I believe in practice Tai Chi. It so works.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I love
I'm writing a webinar on Tai Chi at this rate.
To get someone else to run it. That's awesome. I love that piece about the pharmacists, the National Pharmacists group as well. That's so cool to kind of, so that's those things about collegial support. That's that kind of hope, the positiveness. How cool. I can imagine that would have taken a really amazing leadership, collective leadership as well. That's cool to hear, particularly for rural people, like feeling connected to something wider. And I hear you about nurses and supervision. You know, you guys do heavy stuff, big stuff, day in, day out. Yeah.
Absolutely. And this one's a bit of a sad one, but for them it's saying occupational health nurses work mainly on their own. When they need the support, it's delayed. Then they forget about it. They need that self-compassion. So yeah, hopefully maybe that'd be something to look at doing in the series, would be focusing in more on ways to look at self-compassion.
Absolutely. Yeah, I hear you. And all of this stuff is hard. All of this stuff is a little bit of the stuff that makes us human as well. And we're all on this journey of kind of how can we be more self-compassionate? And again, that's like when we talked a little bit earlier about individual factors that contribute to how we experience these things versus situational factors. I really hear that for occupational nurses, that there's a huge situational factor about accessing support.
Absolutely. Now, well, you've given us a good bit tonight, though. You've taught us to be gentle with ourselves and be kind to ourselves, and to let our body know let us know what to do. Get some guidance from it, eh? And hopefully you're going to get to go and do your yoga soon. 2 weeks.
Practice
2 weeks too long.
Practice what you preach, eh?
So if we were your colleagues, what would we be telling you right now?
Absolutely. Well, I hope everyone has some time for some rest, whether it's a break or not, but over the summer at some point. Thank you guys for listening today. This is my first ever webinar. So thanks for being gentle with me as well, and really humbling to hear some of your experiences. So thank you for sharing as well.
Oh, Ellie, you've made it very easy. Fantastic webinar. Thank you. We've really enjoyed having you this evening. You're a natural at it. You would never have guessed it was your first time. And as I say, real nice, clear messages, things that are relevant to people, things that they can actually take away and use, which is fantastic. And I know it's been really appreciated by those that have joined us this evening. And it'll be interesting to see from the questionnaire where people would like to take that in 2021. Thank you very much for your time this evening.